A city's deepest secrets are not buried in stone, but submerged in water. This is the story of the river walls of memory and how flooding has been deliberately engineered to retell a city's history. You will gain the ability to look at any urban landscape and see the hidden stories written in its floods and defenses. We will uncover how entire districts were washed away to erase a troublesome past, and why some reservoirs hide more than just water. What truth do you think is hidden beneath the placid surface of a city's river? The first cities were born from a paradox, tethered to the very force that could both nourish and destroy them. A river's seasonal rise was a promise of life, depositing rich silt across the floodplains that would feed a growing population. Yet that same rise, if left unchecked, could sweep everything away in a single, furious season. This fundamental tension between bounty and peril ignited humanity's first great engineering project. It was not a temple or a palace, but a simple mound of earth. The levee was our earliest declaration of independence from nature's whims. By piling soil along a riverbank, a community could nudge the water's path, directing its flow to their fields through irrigation canals and shielding their homes from its worst rage. This was the genesis of hydraulic history, the moment water shifted from a force to be feared to a resource to be managed. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, the evidence is etched into the landscape itself. Canals snaked out from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, turning arid land into the breadbasket of empires. The rulers who commanded these works commanded the people, for controlling the water meant controlling the food, the wealth, and ultimately, the destiny of every soul in the city. The same story unfolded along the Indus River, where sophisticated water management systems supported vast, planned cities like Mohenjo-Daro. Their intricate networks of drains and wells were not just feats of engineering, they were the bedrock of civilization. With this newfound power, the stage was quietly set. The ability to control a river's story was, for the first time, within human grasp. A ruler's gaze upon a map saw not rivers, but levers of control. This is the first and most enduring principle of hydraulic history, that flooding is rarely an accident of nature, but a deliberate political instrument. In ancient China, the Yellow River was not merely a waterway, it was a weapon. Dynasties learned that they could consolidate their power, reward loyal provinces, and crush rebellious ones by manipulating the river's immense destructive force. Historical edicts reveal a chillingly pragmatic calculus where the deliberate breaching of a dike was not a failure of engineering, but a success of statecraft. The mechanisms were brutally straightforward. Engineers would construct diversion channels and secondary dikes, not just to control the water, but to aim it. When a region fell out of favor, the order would be given. Workers would dismantle a key section of the main levee, unleashing a torrent specifically directed to wash away the fields, the villages, and the very memory of the dissenters who lived there. The aftermath was then framed not as a punitive flood, but as a heavenly mandate, a natural disaster that proved the ruling house was justified in its actions. The first narrative written by water was one of authority and subjugation, a story where the river itself became an extension of the emperor's will. To understand a city's hidden chronicles, you must first learn to see water not as a resource, but as a tool for writing history. That tool of subjugation would eventually evolve into something even more profound, a means to erase a people's past and write a new story in its place. Envision a vibrant district, a place alive with its own culture, its own traditions, and perhaps its own political opposition. Now picture it silenced not by fire or force, but by water, deliberately submerged beneath the placid surface of a newly created reservoir. This is the second principle of hydraulic history, the erasure and inscription of memory. It is how a city's story is actively rewritten, with inconvenient pasts washed away and new, state-sanctioned narratives poured into the landscape. Modern dam projects provide some of the most striking examples of this hydraulic forgetting. Across the globe, the construction of massive dams has sacrificed thousands of villages, towns, and ancient sites to the rising waters. It was not just homes that were lost, but entire histories, cemeteries, sacred groves, and the very soil where generations had lived. Historians and anthropologists describe a unique form of distress that follows this kind of loss, a feeling called solastalgia. This is the homesickness you feel while still at home, because the home you knew has been fundamentally and irrevocably altered, often in the name of progress. The process is chillingly systematic. First, the physical landmarks are removed, the buildings demolished, the communities displaced and scattered. Then, a new narrative is promoted, one of necessary sacrifice for the greater good, for national electricity, for irrigation, for the future. The old story, the one of the people who lived there, their struggles and their triumphs, is drowned. The new story of a tamed river serving a modern nation is inscribed upon the water itself. This act of hydraulic forgetting is a powerful tool for shaping a collective identity, one that conveniently overlooks what was lost. Yet if you listen closely, the echoes of those erased memories still ripple just beneath the surface. A city council convenes in a grand chamber far from the river's edge. The official record might state they are discussing urban renewal, but the true subject is a neighborhood they consider a blight. The decision is made not with torches but with ledgers and maps. This is the anatomy of an engineered flood, a process as cold and calculated as any military campaign. The first step is always bureaucratic, framing the destruction as progress. The targeted district is labeled unsanitary, or a fire hazard, or politically unstable. This justification provides the moral cover for what comes next. Then, the engineers take their plans from the drawing board to the riverbank. Their task is not to strengthen the city's defenses, but to create a precise and controlled weakness. A specific section of the levee, one that conveniently faces the unwanted neighborhood, is identified. The work is subtle. Perhaps they use poorer quality materials in a repair, or dig a shallow foundation that will erode more easily. They are not building a wall, but a carefully disguised door for the water to enter. Simultaneously, diversion canals might be quietly excavated, not to carry water away, but to channel it directly toward the target, turning the river into a guided missile. The role of the surveyor in this operation is chilling. They are the ones who calculate the exact volume of water required, mapping the flow to ensure it submerges the intended streets while sparing valuable property upstream or downstream. This is not a random deluge, it is a surgical strike. Timing is everything. The operation is scheduled for the spring melt or the height of the rainy season, so the event can be later dismissed as a natural disaster, an unfortunate but inevitable act of God. On the chosen day, the final act begins. The military may be deployed not to rescue, but to cordon off the area, preventing anyone from interfering with the water's new path. When the weakened levee finally gives way, the resulting flood is not chaos. It is the execution of a plan, a silent, liquid eviction notice served to an entire community. The blueprint for reshaping a city's history was not always drawn in stone, but often in ink and water, a testament to the dark precision of political will. The prosperity of a medieval Jewish quarter was a quiet provocation to those in power. Its narrow streets were lined with the homes of merchants, scholars, and craftsmen. a vibrant community integrated into the city's economic life, yet set apart by faith. Then came a season of social unrest, a plague, or a financial crisis, and the quarter became a convenient scapegoat. The whispers began, blaming the community for the city's misfortunes. It was in this charged atmosphere that the river itself seemed to turn against them. A series of strange and localized floods began to strike, each one more severe than the last, each one seemingly focused on that single district. The official chronicles of the time called these events unprecedented, a tragic twist of fate. But if you read between the lines of city council records and tax rolls, a different pattern emerges. The maintenance logs tell the real story. While funds were allocated to strengthen the levees protecting the cathedral and the merchant guild's warehouses, the entries for the quarters section of the wall are curiously sparse. Repairs were delayed, the masonry was left to crumble, and the drainage ditches that should have carried water away were allowed to silt up. This was not an act of God, it was an act of calculated neglect. The river was simply following the path of least resistance, a path that had been deliberately engineered by human hands. After the third or fourth devastating inundation, the narrative solidified. Preachers declared the flooding a clear sign of divine displeasure, a punishment upon the people who lived there. Their resilience was reframed as stubbornness, their presence as a stain on the city's soul. The community, financially ruined and physically broken, had no choice but to abandon their homes. The ruling powers then seized the vacated property, redistributing the valuable land to their allies. The water had accomplished what a mob or a royal decree might have struggled to achieve with such finality. It had washed away not just buildings, but a people's right to belong, erasing their history from the city's map and rewriting it as a story of sin and deserved punishment. The river walls of memory here were not just physical barriers, they were the walls of prejudice, and they were left to decay on purpose. An official city map is never a neutral document. It is a declaration of what matters and, more chillingly, what does not. To unroll one of these historical plans is to read a statement of intent, a blueprint for the future written in ink and imagined geography. Cartographers did not just draw the city as it was, they often drew it as the powers that be wished it to become. In the context of hydraulic storytelling, the map became the first and most persuasive act of rewriting history. Look closely at a planning map from the 18th or 19th century, and you might notice subtle, telling labels. A densely populated neighborhood might be shaded and marked as a flood retention basin, or a low-lying area designated for future water diversion. These were not passive observations of topography. They were active designations marking certain communities as expendable long before the first shovel broke ground on a new levee. The most powerful tool in the cartographer's kit was not the pen but the eraser. The deliberate omission of a village, a neighborhood, or a sacred site from an official state map was a profound act of violence. It was a way of saying these people and their history do not officially exist. This paper erasure often served as the quiet prelude to a physical one. Once a place was no longer on the map, it was far easier to justify its sacrifice to the rising waters of a new reservoir. Experts who study these documents point to the empty spaces, the curiously straight lines where a meandering street should be, as the most telling evidence of a planned disappearance. The process culminated in the creation of a new map, published after the engineered flood had done its work. This new document would show a clean, orderly, and improved landscape. Where there was once a tangled web of streets, there is now only a smooth, blue expanse labeled as a lake. The old names are gone, replaced by new, state-approved titles. The map presents this not as a loss, but as a gain, a necessary step forward for progress and safety. It solidifies the new official history, turning a complex act of social engineering into a simple, objective fact. The river and the map worked in concert, one to wash away the past, the other to draw a future that pretended that past had never been. The most powerful lie a river can tell is that it acted alone. This is the third principle, the illusion of inevitability, where an engineered outcome is presented as an unavoidable act of nature or the unstoppable march of progress. To maintain this illusion, a very specific language is deployed in the wake of a flood. Official proclamations and news reports are saturated with words like catastrophe, act of God, and tragic necessity. These terms are not merely descriptive, they are strategic. They form a linguistic barrier that actively obscures any trace of human agency, redirecting blame from city planners to the heavens or to the indifferent forces of the natural world. This language is then carved into the landscape itself. Consider a public memorial for a devastating flood. The plaque will likely mourn the lives lost to a terrible disaster, a force beyond human control. It will never mention the city council vote that defunded levee maintenance in that specific district, or the engineering report that warned of the precise weakness that eventually failed. The official story, set in bronze and stone, becomes the permanent record, while the paper trail of decisions is buried in forgotten archives. It is this buried paper trail that shatters the illusion. Decades later, a historian or journalist might unearth internal memos and planning documents. These records reveal a chillingly different story. They show cost-benefit analyses that literally calculated the value of one neighborhood against another. They contain meeting minutes where officials openly discussed the political advantages of letting the river cleanse a problematic area. The contrast between the public narrative of a tragic accident and the private record of conscious choices creates a deep cognitive dissonance in the collective memory. A community might know, on some level, that the flood was not entirely natural, but the overwhelming weight of the official story, repeated in ceremonies and textbooks, makes that truth feel like a fragile rumor. To master this principle is to learn to read the gaps between the public memorial and the private memo. It is to recognize that when a government speaks of an act of God, you must look for the human hands that drew the blueprints for that very act. But the riverbed guards its secrets well. It is a vast and wet archive, and we are only now learning how to read its pages. Modern archaeologists are no longer limited to shovels and brushes. They descend into these silent, submerged worlds armed with side-scan sonar that paints a ghostly image of the drowned landscape below. They use underwater drones to glide through the murky depths, their cameras capturing the outlines of streets and foundations invisible from the surface. The most telling evidence often comes from a deceptively simple tool, a sediment corer. This device plunges deep into the riverbed silt, pulling up a long, layered cylinder of history. Each stratum of mud and soil is like a page in a book, recording exactly how the water arrived. A sudden, catastrophic flood leaves one kind of signature, a chaotic jumble of debris and coarse sand. But the cores taken from sites of engineered flooding tell a different, slower story. They reveal layer upon uniform layer of fine silt, the unmistakable fingerprint of a deliberately and patiently rising reservoir. This is not the story of a violent act of nature, but of a calm, calculated drowning. The ruins themselves confirm this. In one recently studied valley, now a popular lake, sonar imaging revealed the stark foundations of an entire village. The walls were found standing upright, not toppled by a raging current. The artifacts were nestled in place, not scattered by a torrent. This was not a community smashed by a flood. It was one that was quietly and methodically submerged, its story suspended in time beneath the water. These silent ruins are the ultimate testament, the physical evidence that contradicts the dry official records claiming a natural disaster. Every straight foundation line mapped by a drone, every pottery shard recovered from the silt, is a voice from the past refusing to be silenced. The river walls of memory were built to last, not of stone, but of water itself, and they are finally beginning to speak. The official photographs from the groundbreaking ceremony show men in suits smiling as they dig the first shovels of earth. They called it the Lake of Progress, a reservoir that would power a new era with clean hydroelectricity. But beneath the placid blue surface they envisioned lay the village of Orkenlock, a community that would simply cease to exist. Its name, which once meant field by the lake, is now a cruel irony found only on maps printed before 1952. The official story was one of seamless transition. The government promised the residents fair compensation and new homes in a planned township a dozen miles away. On paper, it was a simple relocation. But the human heart is not a line on a ledger. Oral histories collected from the descendants paint a far more haunting picture. They speak of the scent of pine smoke from the hearths, the particular way the morning sun hit the cobblestones of the main square, and the deep, resonant tone of the single church bell that called people to worship and marked the passing hours. These are the textures of a lived-in world, details that cannot be itemized or compensated for. When the people of Orkenlock were scattered, they did not just lose their houses. They lost the intricate web of connections that bound them together. The baker no longer lived next to the schoolteacher. The farmer's wife could no longer easily check on the elderly widow down the lane. The community, as a living organism, was dismembered. In the new township, the streets were laid out in a sterile grid, the houses were identical, and the silence was deafening. The profound loss was not of brick and mortar, but of soul. The reservoir did not just generate power, it actively generated a new, sanitized history. The old village, with all its quirks and its complicated past, was reframed as a backward place, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of the national good. It became a ghost story, a half-remembered dream. Yet, on quiet nights, the descendants say that if the wind blows right across the vast lake, you can still hear the echo of a bell that never stopped ringing, a stubborn memory refusing to be drowned. The murky waters of a flood recede to reveal a landscape of opportunity for those positioned to see it. This is the fourth principle of hydraulic history, the economics of deluge, where public disaster is systematically converted into private windfall. Behind every great engineered flood, there is often a great fortune waiting to be made. The mechanism is as ruthless as it is effective. First, a targeted neighborhood is allowed to flood, its property values drowning under the weight of contaminated water and official neglect. Then, once the former residents have been forced to sell in desperation or have been legally evicted from what is now declared unsafe land, the speculators move in. They acquire vast tracts of this now blighted but strategically located land for pennies on the dollar. The very water that was used to destroy the old community has now cleared the ground for a lucrative new development. The financial incentive does not end with cheap land. The subsequent phase of reconstruction is a gold rush for a select group of contractors. The contracts to build the new, improved levees, the modern drainage canals, and the rebuilt infrastructure are worth millions. Corporate records and land deeds from specific periods tell a clear story. You can trace a line from a city councillor who voted to defund levee maintenance in a certain ward to a sudden, substantial donation to their political campaign from a construction magnate. That same magnate's company is then, almost miraculously, awarded the sole contract to rebuild the entire district once the water is pumped away. The flood, in this light, was not a breakdown of the system, but a perverse form of market correction. It was a way to liquidate inconvenient communities and outdated property arrangements, clearing the way for a more profitable and politically aligned urban landscape. The river's path was not just charted by engineers, but by accountants and investors who understood that the most powerful force in a city was not water but capital. To follow the money in a city's history is very often to follow the water, straight to the doors of those who profited from its destructive path. A society rarely erases its own history without first telling itself a story. When the physical act of drowning a valley was complete, the final and most crucial step was to sanctify the loss, to weave it into the sacred tapestry of local myth. A deliberately flooded village did not simply vanish. It was reborn in folklore as a city of sin, punished by a vengeful god or a capricious water spirit. This spiritual alchemy transformed a cold, political calculation into a divine parable, making the event morally justifiable and emotionally acceptable to the survivors. Across cultures, flood myths share a hauntingly consistent structure. There is always a transgression, whether it is human arrogance, a broken taboo, or communal wickedness. Then comes the deluge, a purifying wrath that washes the world clean. Finally, there is a rebirth, a new beginning for a chosen few who are deemed worthy. The ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh tells of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy a noisy, bothersome humanity. In the biblical story of Noah, the flood is a response to the corruption and violence that has filled the earth. What if these enduring stories were not merely allegories, but distant, distorted echoes of real events? What if the original transgression was not sin, but disobedience to a local ruler, and the purifying flood was not an act of God, but an engineered release of water from a breached levee? Over generations, the human agent of the disaster fades from memory, leaving only the terrifying, abstract force of divine judgment. The legend of a drowned city, its church bells still heard on foggy nights, is not just a ghost story. It is the ultimate tool of control, a narrative that shifts blame from the powerful to the powerless, and from the community to itself. The people who once lived in the drowned valley come to believe their own ancestors deserved their fate, that they brought the water upon themselves through some collective moral failure. The landscape itself becomes a permanent sermon, a reminder of the price of stepping out of line. The stories we tell about our rivers and lakes are rarely just stories. They are often the carefully crafted remains of a forgotten crime, a weapon that continues to shape memory long after the water has stilled. A blueprint does not feel guilt, and a ledger cannot wrestle with its conscience. The true weight of these engineered floods was borne by the people who designed and built them. We find their private struggles not in official reports, but in the fragile pages of a diary or the hesitant tone of a letter home. One engineer, tasked with calculating the precise water volume needed to submerge a neighborhood, wrote to his wife of his sleepless nights. He described how the neat lines of his calculations kept blurring into the faces of the people he saw in the market. His professional pride in solving a complex hydraulic problem was forever poisoned by the knowledge of its human cost. These men were not monsters, they were professionals caught in a terrible bind. Many soothed their consciences with the potent language of progress. They told themselves they were not destroying a community, but conquering a floodplain. They were not erasing history, but building the future. The greater good became a shield against the immediate, terrible consequences of their work. A senior architect might have justified his plans by focusing on the modern housing that would eventually replace the so-called slums, or the clean electricity that would power 1 million homes. This abstraction of the benefit made the destruction of a few hundred lives seem, if not acceptable, then at least necessary. Yet for every professional who found solace in this cold calculus, there was another who carried a silent, persistent regret. Decades after a reservoir was filled, An elderly surveyor might confess to a historian that he still dreamed of the church spire he had last seen piercing the water's surface before it vanished forever. He had done his job with technical perfection, but he knew he had helped drown a piece of his city's soul. These personal accounts force us to see that the river walls of memory were not built by faceless forces, but by human hand. Their dilemma echoes in our own time, when we benefit from the cheap electricity of a controversial dam, or when we admire the modern skyline of a city built on cleared neighborhoods, we too become part of a chain of complicity. The question they faced is one we must now ask ourselves. How do we reconcile our own comfort with the hidden costs of the systems we inhabit? The blueprint for the canal was presented as a marvel of modern engineering, a straight line of pure commerce that would bring wealth to the entire city. But if you lay that old map over a contemporary one, the line does something else entirely. It carves through the urban fabric with surgical precision, running directly along the boundary where the tree-lined avenues of the affluent West met the crowded tenements of the industrial East. The official reasons were all about efficiency and public health. The city fathers spoke of improved trade routes and flushing waste away from the population centers. Yet the planning committee's own internal memos tell a different story. One particularly revealing document argued for the chosen route because it would, and I quote, provide a natural and permanent firebreak against the spread of disorder from the manufacturing district. The canal was not just a transportation project, it was a deliberate act of social distancing on a massive scale, engineered in brick and water. This liquid wall was far more effective than any fence or patrol. On the affluent western bank, the waterway was adorned with ornamental bridges and promenades, a picturesque feature that increased property values. The factories, however, were all concentrated on the eastern side. Their waste, the chemical dyes from the textile mills and the heavy metals from the foundries, was discharged directly into the canal. The prevailing winds conveniently carried the smog and the stench eastward, ensuring the West Bank remained clean and desirable. The flow of the water itself became a delivery system for inequality. The western neighborhoods had easy access to clean, piped water from upstream reservoirs. The eastern districts, downstream from all the pollution, relied on increasingly contaminated wells, leading to outbreaks of cholera and typhoid that were then used as further proof of the area's unsanitary character. The canal did not just separate two parts of the city, it engineered two different environments, two different realities, and two different destinies. The consequences rippled through generations. A job on the western side meant a daily journey across one of the few bridges, a tangible reminder of the divide. Social interactions became formalized and rare. A child born on the East Bank was born into a landscape of smoke and limited horizons. Their access to the city's parks, better schools, and influential networks choked off by that stagnant industrial moat. The waterway fossilized the class structure, making it as solid and unmovable as the stone of its locks. The canal's true cargo was not coal and cotton, but a relentless, silent message of separation. It whispered to the West that its prosperity was deserved and protected, and it screamed to the East that its plight was its own fault, a natural consequence of its location. This was hydraulic engineering not as a tool for development, but as a mechanism for casting social hierarchy in stone, or rather in water, creating a barrier that long outlasted the industries it was built to serve. A blueprint can be erased, but a song is much harder to drown. The fifth and perhaps most hopeful principle in this story is the profound resilience of counter-narratives. Even as water is used to suppress history, the human spirit finds a way to make that history float back to the surface. The most enduring resistance often flows through the quietest channels. An elderly woman teaches her granddaughter a folk song about a valley now buried under a reservoir. The lyrics describe the exact shade of the wildflowers that grew on a particular hillside, a detail no official map would ever bother to record. With each generation that learns the melody, the memory of that landscape is kept alive, a ghostly geography preserved in rhythm and rhyme. These oral traditions become a living archive passed from mouth to ear, completely independent of the state's records. Other stories survive through acts of quiet defiance. A family, forcibly relocated from their ancestral village, risks everything to secretly preserve a wooden sign bearing its old name. For decades, they hide it in an attic, a tangible piece of a world that officially no longer exists. These clandestine archives, whether they are a bundle of letters, a hand-drawn map, or a single photograph, are protected at great personal cost. They are not just keepsakes, they are evidence. In our digital age, this fight for memory has found powerful new tools. Grassroots archaeology projects now crowdsource funds to conduct their own surveys of submerged sites, using affordable sonar equipment to challenge the findings of official reports. Citizen journalists interview the last surviving residents of a drowned town, uploading their testimonies to the internet where they cannot be so easily buried. Digital activists use open-source mapping software to layer historical maps over modern satellite imagery, creating interactive overlays that visually resurrect what was lost. With a few clicks, anyone can see the ghost of the old village hovering just beneath the blue surface of the lake. These modern counter-narratives create a distributed, decentralized memory, one that is far more difficult to erase than a single paper record in a city hall basement. They act as a collective corrective, a chorus of voices that insists the official story is incomplete. The river walls of memory, built to be so permanent and imposing, are in fact porous. The truth, like water itself, always finds a way to seep through. That knowledge, the slow dawning realization that the water was not an indifferent force but a deliberate tool, changes the nature of the loss entirely. This is the deep psychology of hydraulic trauma, a distinct form of collective grief that scars a population for generations. When a community is displaced by a genuine natural disaster, the trauma is immense, but it is often framed by a sense of shared fate and communal resilience. The suffering is blamed on nature's chaos, but when that same community later uncovers evidence that their suffering was engineered, that city planners made a conscious choice to sacrifice their homes, the grief curdles into something else. It becomes a trauma laced with a profound sense of betrayal. The very institutions meant to protect them were the ones who orchestrated their ruin. Environmental psychologists who study these communities identify a clear and harrowing pattern. The initial shock of displacement is followed by a persistent, low-grade distrust of all authority, a suspicion that becomes woven into the cultural fabric. This is not a simple grudge, it is a learned survival mechanism. How can you ever trust a government map, a new development plan, or a promise of aid when your ancestors learned the hard way that such documents and words could be weapons? This fractured trust perpetuates itself, creating a social schism between those who benefit from the new landscape and those who were its casualties. The trauma also manifests as a fractured sense of identity. Imagine your family's story for generations being rooted in a particular valley. Your sense of self is tied to that soil, that view, that specific pattern of light through the trees. When that place is erased, not by chance but by decree, a part of your own history feels deliberately invalidated. You are told implicitly that your story was not important enough to save. This leads to a quiet, intergenerational shame and a feeling of rootlessness, even for descendants who never knew the original home. They inherit a ghost limb of a community, an ache for a place they have never seen. This psychological scar becomes a silent undercurrent in the city's daily life. It might surface as a neighborhood's resistance to a new city planning initiative, dismissed as stubbornness by outsiders who do not know the history. It might appear as a local legend about a cursed lake, a folk tale that encodes the true story of betrayal in a way that is safe to remember. To understand a city fully, you must learn to listen for this silence, to recognize that the deepest wounds are not always visible in the architecture, but in the unspoken suspicions and the inherited sorrows of its people. The true cost of rewriting a city with water is not measured in flooded acres, but in this broken trust, a debt that continues to compound long after the reservoirs have stilled. A government document cannot capture the smell of wet earth and lost hearths, but a poet can. When the official record is designed to obscure, art becomes the most dangerous form of archive. It preserves not just the facts of a flood, but its feeling, the raw texture of a loss that ledger books and engineering reports deliberately sanitize. Take the painter who stood before a newly formed reservoir, his canvas capturing not just the water, but the skeletal tops of fence posts still piercing the surface like silent accusations. His brushstrokes recorded the specific, melancholic hue of the twilight on that drowned valley, a visual testament that refused to let the landscape be forgotten. This was not a landscape of progress, it was a graveyard, and his art made that undeniable. Writers, too, have served as secret historians. In their novels, we find characters forever marked by a receding waterline, their personal histories severed by a dam they never voted for. A story might follow a man who returns year after year to the shore of the artificial lake, staring at the water as if he could still see the roof of his childhood home shimmering in the depths. Through his grief, the reader experiences the true cost of that engineered progress, a cost that official press releases labeled as necessary. These fictional lives become vessels for a collective, suppressed memory, giving a name and a face to the anonymous thousands counted as mere statistics in a relocation report. And then there are the poets whose verses act as direct elegies for submerged worlds. A poem can immortalize the name of a single cobbled street, the sound of a particular blacksmith's hammer, the exact pattern of moss on a forgotten millstone. These are the intimate details that define a place, the very soul of a community that bureaucracy intentionally strips away in the name of efficiency. The poet's words become a chant against forgetting, a spell to keep a ghost town alive in the mind long after it has vanished from the map. This artistic resistance transforms private grief into public witness. A painting hanging in a gallery, a novel on a shelf, a poem recited at a gathering, they all defy the state's narrative of a clean, improved future. They insist that the past, in all its messy, beautiful, and painful reality, still matters. They ensure that the voices of the drowned are not silenced, but amplified through the enduring power of story and image. In the long struggle against the river walls of memory, art is the quiet, relentless current that slowly wears the stone away. The colossal sea gate stood as a gleaming monument to civic pride, a titanic jaw of steel and concrete designed to clamp shut against the ocean's rage. Its official purpose was absolute protection, a promise of safety for the entire coastal city. But for the residents of the Marshview district, a crowded neighborhood built on the city's vulnerable outskirts, the gate told a different story with every storm. They began to notice a pattern, a chilling synchronicity between their own political protests and the gate's peculiar failures. During periods of social calm, the massive barriers sealed perfectly. Yet whenever Marshview organized a major strike or a demonstration against city policies, the sea gate would suffer a sudden, inexplicable malfunction right at the peak of a high tide. The official press releases always spoke of heroic engineers battling unforeseen technical glitches, but the water always seemed to find the same path, surging through the gap to flood Marshview streets while leaving the affluent city center bone dry. An independent analysis of tidal records and maintenance logs reveals this correlation was anything but random. The data shows that on dates coinciding with civil unrest in Marshview, the gate's closure mechanism was deliberately delayed by a critical 20 minutes, just long enough for the storm surge to be funneled by secondary barriers directly into the low-lying district. The engineering reports filed after these events never cited human error, only vague and unresolved issues with sensor arrays or hydraulic pressure, explanations that evaporated upon any serious technical scrutiny. For the people of Marshview, the trauma was cyclical and deliberate. Each flood ruined ground floor businesses, destroyed personal property, and forced families into temporary shelters, systematically crippling the community's economic stability and morale. The city's narrative was one of a valiant fight against nature, but the reality for those in the targeted district was a slow-moving, politically engineered dissolution. Their neighborhood was not being protected, it was being pacified, its spirit and its structures methodically eroded by the very infrastructure built to safeguard the city. The sea gate, that symbol of security, had become the precise instrument of their subjugation, proving that a wall is never just a wall. It is a statement of who and what lies on the correct side of history. The city's true biography is not written in its libraries, but in the height of its doorsteps and the width of its streets. This is the sixth principle, a legacy carved into urban form, where the consequences of historical flooding are literally set in stone and concrete. The city itself is a palimpsest, a manuscript where the old stories of water have been partially erased, yet their ghostly impressions remain, visible to anyone who knows how to look. Take a simple building from the 19th century in a district once known for its seasonal inundations. You will notice its foundation is oddly tall, with a flight of steps leading up to the main entrance, a feature modern buildings on the same street lack. This elevated base was not an architectural flourish. It was a direct response to a known flood level, a permanent defense against the water's memory. The building's very posture tells you this was a place that expected to get its feet wet, or consider a strangely wide, curving boulevard that seems to serve no clear traffic pattern. It cuts through the city with an inexplicable grace. Now overlay a historical map. You will find that this boulevard follows the exact path of a canal that was filled in a century ago. That empty space, that generous curve, is the ghost of the waterway that once defined the neighborhood's identity and its segregation. The pavement under your feet is merely a lid on a buried river. The most profound legacies, however, are social and economic. The value of land on the historically protected side of an old levee remains higher than the value on the floodplain side, even if that levee has been gone for 100 years. The neighborhood that was once deemed expendable by city planners often remains poorer, with less political clout and fewer public services, its destiny sealed by a hydrological decision made generations ago. The city's layout actively perpetuates the ancient inequalities that the water was used to create. To walk through an old city with this knowledge is to read a hidden text. You are no longer just seeing buildings and roads, you are deciphering a record of fear, of power, and of survival. That empty lot is not vacant, it is a testament to a house that was washed away and never rebuilt. That park is not just a green space, it is a former flood retention basin, a place that was always intended to get wet. The past is not dead, it is embedded in the very pavement we walk on, a silent, stony witness to the stories the river tried to tell. The same principles that carved riverbeds now shape the streams of your digital life. We have entered the era of digital water, where the endless flood is no longer made of rain, but of data. The ancient engineers who diverted rivers to control a population's geography have their direct counterparts in the architects of the algorithms that now channel the flow of information. Their goal is strikingly similar: to control the narrative by managing the deluge. Imagine the river of online content, a torrent of news articles, social media posts, and video clips. This is not a natural, free-flowing stream. It is a meticulously managed system with digital levees and algorithmic gates directing the current. These systems are designed with a specific purpose: to keep you within their banks, to maximize your engagement, and in doing so, they inevitably shape what you see and what you do not. A contentious historical event, for instance, does not appear in your feed as a complex, multifaceted story. The algorithm, optimized for outrage or affinity, will funnel you toward one overpowering narrative, effectively drowning out all competing perspectives in a flood of confirming evidence. This is the modern-day equivalent of washing away a troublesome district, but instead of a neighborhood, it is a nuanced truth that gets submerged. The digital reservoir does not hold water, it holds attention, and its contents are curated to promote a specific version of reality. The most powerful part of this system is its illusion of neutrality. Just as a medieval citizen might have believed their local flood was an act of God, we are encouraged to believe our personalized feed is a simple reflection of the world. We do not see the thousands of calculations that determined which story would be amplified and which would be silenced. The outcome, however, is a landscape of the mind where some memories are reinforced until they feel like immutable facts, while others are eroded into obscurity. This is how our collective story is now being rewritten, not with shovels and water, but with lines of code and vast server farms. The river walls of memory have been rebuilt in the digital realm, and we are all living in the shadow of their ever-rising banks. A modern city planner faces a choice more difficult than any ancient emperor. Their dilemma is not about wielding water as a weapon, but about deciding where it will be allowed to go as climate change supercharges storms and raises sea levels. The technical term for one of their most controversial tools is managed retreat, the deliberate and planned relocation of people and infrastructure away from high-risk areas. On its surface, this sounds like a rational, sober response to a changing world. But look closer at the maps used to designate these new floodplains and sacrificial zones, and you will see a hauntingly familiar pattern. The neighborhoods most often slated for managed retreat are not the wealthy waterfront estates, but the historically marginalized communities living on the least expensive, most vulnerable land. The very communities that were pushed to the river's edge by economic forces generations ago are now being asked to move again, to make the ultimate sacrifice for the collective safety. This process risks repeating the oldest story in hydraulic history, where the costs of environmental adaptation are disproportionately borne by those with the least power to object. The ethical calculations are brutally complex. Is it fair to spend billions to protect a few homes on a crumbling cliff, or should that money be used to buy out an entire neighborhood and return the land to the wetlands? There is no easy answer, only a series of difficult trade-offs. Yet the way these decisions are made and who gets a seat at the table will determine everything. If the process is not transparent and deeply democratic, if it is driven solely by cost-benefit analyses that put a price tag on community and history, then we are not just managing a retreat. We are actively engineering the social floods of the future. The empty lots and relocated towns we create today will be the historical mysteries for our descendants, who will one day uncover our meeting minutes and our environmental impact reports. They will analyze our choices, searching for the human hands behind what we will likely call an unavoidable climate disaster. They will ask if we, with all our advanced science and our professed values, simply found a new language for an ancient practice, using the rising waters to once again write a selective version of our history upon the land. A river can be undammed. The seventh and perhaps most hopeful principle is reclamation and restorative hydrology, a conscious effort to dismantle the river walls of memory. This is not merely an engineering retrofit, it is a profound act of historical and psychological healing, an attempt to mend the broken relationship between a city and its water. After centuries of using water to control and erase, some communities are now working to set it free, and in doing so, are reclaiming pieces of their own buried past. In Seoul, South Korea, a massive elevated highway once roared through the city center, a monument to the Auto Age built directly over the Cheonggyecheon stream. The stream was not just buried, it was forgotten, a concrete tomb for a natural landmark. Then, in a stunning reversal, the city government chose to tear down the highway and daylight the stream. The project was not without its critics, who cited the immense cost and disruption, but the result was transformative. Where there was only noise and exhaust, there is now the sound of flowing water and children playing. The restored stream became a vibrant public space, but its impact went deeper. It resurfaced a lost piece of the city's identity, reconnecting citizens with a natural feature that had been erased from both the map and collective memory. The act of daylighting the Cheonggyecheon was a public apology to the river and a correction to the historical record. Similarly, across Europe and North America, obsolete dams are being dismantled. These structures, once hailed as triumphs of progress, had long since outlived their usefulness, instead trapping sediment, blocking fish migrations, and warming the water. Their removal is a physical admission of a past mistake. As the concrete is broken apart and the river is allowed to flow freely again, something remarkable happens. Within a single season, life returns. Salmon and trout navigate reaches they haven't seen in generations. The river rediscovers its old meandering path, and the surrounding landscape begins to breathe. Each removed dam is a retraction of an old, arrogant story, replaced by a new narrative of humility and coexistence. This is restorative hydrology in action. It recognizes that the health of a community is inextricably linked to the health of its water. By restoring a floodplain, we are not just creating a space for a river to safely overflow, we are acknowledging that our attempts to fully control nature were flawed. We are making room for the river's own story, one that includes both its seasonal rhythms and its occasional fury. These projects are acts of historical justice, a way of giving a voice back to the landscape and to the communities whose histories were washed away in the name of control. They ask a fundamental question: can we learn to listen to the water again, not as a force to be dominated, but as a partner in writing the next chapter of our cities? A cracked church bell, silent for 70 years, now rings again in the dry mountain air. It does not toll for a service, but for a festival. Every year, when a severe drought causes the water level in the massive Lake Reservoir to drop, the skeleton of the town of Alder Creek reemerges from the depths. Its foundations, its old main street, and the cemetery on the hill all return to the sun for a few precious weeks. For decades, this was a time of quiet sorrow for the displaced families, a painful reopening of an old wound. But then something shifted in the community. The descendants decided that if the water would periodically give their history back to them, they would not mourn its return, they would celebrate it. They created the Festival of the Returning Waters, an event that has transformed a site of engineered loss into a vibrant ground of reclaimed memory. The festival is an act of gentle defiance. Locals and former residents now lead guided tours along the muddy, exposed streets. They point out where the general store once stood, where children played in the town square, and they share stories passed down from grandparents who actually lived there. They do not just describe buildings, they recount the scent of fresh bread from the bakery and the sound of the blacksmith's hammer on a summer afternoon. They are not archaeologists, they are storytellers, and their tools are not trowels, but personal anecdotes that breathe life back into the ghost town. This annual ritual has become a powerful form of education, not just about local history, but about the politics of water and memory. Children who only knew Alder Creek as a legend can now walk its paths and touch its stones, forging a tangible connection to a past that was meant to be forgotten. The festival uses the very rhythm of the water that once erased the town to periodically reaffirm its existence. The reservoir, built to drown a story, has ironically become the mechanism for its most dramatic and public retelling. In this act of collective remembrance, the community has achieved the ultimate triumph over engineered oblivion. They have taken the master's tool of water and turned it into a stage for their own enduring narrative, proving that even the deepest flood cannot wash away a story that a people are determined to keep alive. These 7 principles, like the stones in a levee, interlock to form a single, powerful framework. We have seen water wielded as a political instrument, a deliberate tool for reward and punishment. We have witnessed how it erases and inscribes memory, drowning inconvenient pasts to write state-sanctioned futures. We have learned to see through the illusion of inevitability, that clever lie which hides human agency behind the mask of natural disaster. We have followed the money in the economics of Deluge, where public tragedy is converted into private fortune. We have taken heart from the resilience of counter-narratives, the songs and stories that keep submerged truths afloat. We have read the legacy in urban form, where the city's very layout tells a story of ancient floods and calculated risks. And we have found hope in reclamation and restorative hydrology, the conscious effort to heal a landscape and mend a broken relationship with water. When you bring these 7 lenses together, they transform how you see the world. A simple walk through any city becomes a detective's investigation. Why does this neighborhood have such tall foundations? Why does that wide boulevard curve for no apparent reason? Why is this park here? And why does that part of town always seem to flood first during a heavy rain? The answers are rarely simple matters of geography or bad luck. They are the legacies of old decisions, of power dynamics and financial interests that used water as their chosen medium. This toolkit empowers you to question the official story. It allows you to look at a reservoir and wonder what lies beneath, to study a modern flood zone and ask who benefits from the redevelopment that will inevitably follow. The river walls of memory are all around us, not just of stone and water, but of policy and prejudice. Armed with these principles, you now hold the key to reading them. The water's final lesson is that history is a fluid thing, shaped less by stone than by the currents of human choice. Our journey along the river walls of memory has shown us that a city's deepest chronicles are not found in libraries, but in the engineered path of a stream and the silent depths of a reservoir. We have traced how water was weaponized to wash away inconvenient pasts, inscribe new tales of power, and control the very narrative of a community. This pattern, from the ancient breaching of a dike to the algorithmic channels of our digital age, reveals a persistent truth about how stories are built and broken. Yet against this tide of controlled forgetting, we have also witnessed the unyielding strength of the human spirit. Through folk songs, secret archives, and community festivals, counter-narratives rise like stubborn islands in a flood, refusing to let memory be drowned. The most profound mystery left for us is not what happened in the past, but how we, right now, decide to remember it. The responsibility is ours. I urge you to walk to the nearest river in your own city, or to trace the line of an old canal on a map. Look at the height of the old foundations, question the reason for a strangely empty park, and listen for the local legends of a drowned village. What hidden story is that waterway guarding? What truth is it waiting to whisper, if only we learn to ask the right questions? Share the local mysteries you uncover in the comments below. If this exploration of submerged histories has changed the way you see the world beneath your feet, consider subscribing for more journeys into the world's greatest historical puzzles.